Okay, picture this. You're listening to a super popular interview show. The host is talking to a famous guest, leaning into this incredibly expensive studio mic, and they start spinning this wild, shocking story about something that happened to their buddy last week. It's an insane story, right? But then the host gets real serious, looks at the camera, and says, and you know what? That is exactly why our entire society is collapsing. And we just kind of nod along. I mean, it makes total sense in the moment. Well, actually, scratch that. It really doesn't. What's really happening there is you are falling for literally the oldest trick in the modern media playbook. It's designed to completely manipulate your worldview. We're talking about a massive logical flaw that has, quite frankly, infected long-form media. So in this explainer, we're going to decode exactly why these charismatic hosts use a tiny sliver of evidence to bend reality, why your brain is biologically hardwired to fall for it, and, most importantly, how you can defend your own critical thinking in real time.
All right, let's kick things off with part one. The problem, the insufficient sample. So, what we're really talking about here is the exact definition of a hasty generalization. In the world of logic, this happens when someone makes a sweeping claim about a massive, highly complex issue, but they base it entirely on an incredibly small or just completely terrible sample size. Imagine finding a single bruise on one apple and instantly deciding, well, all the apples in the entire world must be rotten. That's exactly what debaters are doing when they use a tiny sliver of evidence to make these huge, sweeping claims.
You see this all the time. Hosts will take one single isolated anecdote. Maybe they saw tents on one specific street corner, or they had one bad interaction with a police officer, and they falsely present it as this universal rule. They just leap straight to the conclusion that an entire city is an unlivable nightmare, or that every single institution is corrupt to the core. They're basically taking a singular, random incident and packaging it as undeniable proof of a massive national trend.
Let me ask you directly, and be honest with yourself here. Have you ever bought into a massive claim just because some millionaire podcaster told a really cool story? You know, oh, my buddy had a terrible experience with that diet, so clearly the entire medical establishment is lying to us. Sound familiar? If you've ever caught yourself nodding along to a huge conclusion just because the narrative was super entertaining, well, you've experienced this firsthand.
Which brings us to part two, the agitation, the survival glitch.
Okay, so these shows thrive on storytelling because, let's face it, anecdotes are incredibly entertaining. But the real danger? It actually lies in our biology. You see, the hasty generalization is considered the most common logical fallacy out there because human beings generalize purely to survive. Think about it. If a caveman saw bush rustling or saw one bad berry make his friend sick, his brain instantly generalized that it was a predator or poison. That kept him alive. But that exact same survival glitch that kept a caveman alive in the jungle, it completely wrecks our logic when we're reacting to a single bad news story on the internet.
And charismatic debaters know this. They purposefully confuse an inductive guess with deductive certainty. When a host tells a super vivid story, your brain takes that very limited information and tries to build a universal rule out of it. But really, they are taking an inductive guess, which is just a likelihood based on a tiny sample, and treating it as absolute, undeniable deductive proof. They confuse an isolated incident with statistical reality. And when millions of people tune in, it ends up completely polarizing society because we're all out here arguing over dramatic stories instead of actual facts. So, here is your harsh mathematical reality check. An anecdote is literally just a sample size of 1. And mathematically speaking, a sample size of 1 is completely, totally worthless. I mean, it doesn't matter how angry a host gets or how incredibly confidently they speak into that microphone, anecdotal evidence is only evidence of an anecdote, period.
To really put that into perspective, relying on a single anecdote to prove a global theory is exactly like eating one bad French fry and declaring that all potatoes on Earth are poison. I know, it sounds absolutely ridiculous when we talk about French fries, right? But think about it. We let modern media personalities get away with this exact same logic every single day when they talk about our society, our health, and our economy.
So how do we fix it? Let's move to part 3, the solution, the sample size framework.
The key here is that you can't just get swept up in the emotion of a good story. You have to learn how to anchor yourself back in actual data using these 3 simple steps. Step 1 is to isolate the anecdote. The second someone tries to use a personal story to prove a universal law, you need to mentally drop a massive, heavy iron gate between their narrative and the math. You can totally acknowledge their story, sure, but you have to actively strip away the global conclusion they're trying to attach to it.
Then we hit step 2, which is to actively demand the macro data. You literally have to force them to expand their sample size. You can just calmly say, you know, that is a fascinating personal experience,
But what does the actual macro data say? By doing this, you are forcing the conversation away from isolated random incidents and demanding actual peer-reviewed statistics to prove whether this is a widespread trend or just a one-off event.
And finally, step 3, expose the logical flaw directly. If they double down and insist that their one story is all the proof they need, call it out. Tell them, look, you're using a hasty generalization. You're taking a poor, unrepresentative sample and trying to apply it to everyone. You confidently state that until they have sufficient evidence, they only have an anecdote. They do not have an argument.
All right, let's wrap this explainer up with part 4, the takeaway, defeating the generalization. I want to give you the ultimate psychological cheat code to use against an anecdotal debater in real time. Whether you're listening to a show or just arguing with someone out in the real world, this is exactly how you shut the manipulation down. You look them dead in the eye, give a slight smile, and say, "I'm sorry that happened to you, but your personal experience is not a substitute for empirical data. Do you have any actual numbers or just a good story?" Just watch their unearned confidence completely evaporate. You are refusing to let them bypass your logic by hacking your survival instincts. At the end of the day, a genuine debate requires us to look at the full picture. So ask yourself, do we have the intellectual humility to look at representative facts, or are we going to let convenient, viral anecdotes dictate our reality? The next time you hear a wild story being passed off as the absolute truth, remember the sample size, stay sharp, trust the data, and please, never let a single anecdote define your world.